Haboim, welcome everyone. We're about to begin Be'ezras Hashem together on Daf Nun Ches Amud Aleph at the very top, the beginning of the fifth parak. The fifth parak now begins the focus on the Korban Pesach. Until now we've been discussing Hilchas, Chometz, and Matzah. Now, as the Gaonim point out, there's two different parts of Maseches Psachim. They actually had it as two Masechtas. The first Masechta was Pesach Rishon. The second Masechta was Pesach Sheni. Of course, our Gemara puts the tractate together as Psachim. But the beginning of the fifth parak and onwards discusses Korban Pesach. The Korban Pesach was a mitzvah asay midi araisa for every Jew in the time of the Beis Hamikdash to bring a Korban Pesach on Yudalid Benisan Bein Ha'arboim. That subsequent night on Tes Vav, Leil HaSeder, it was required that every Jew eat a kazayis of roasted Korban Pesach. It's interesting to note that amongst all of the chiyuvei krisus, there are two exceptions to the rule. The rule is that the krisus comes about when one is oiver a certain mitzvah loisase, a lav. But there's two exceptions that a mitzvah asay also carries it with it the punishment of krisus. One of them is one who's mevatel the Korban Pesach. And the second one, parenthetically, is one who's mevatel mitzvahs milah. The Mishnah opens up with discussing the Korban Tamid shel bein ha'arboim. Since it's the afternoon, specifically after the Korban Tamid is brought, then we bring the Korban Pesach. Says the Mishnah, Tamid nishchat b'shmoina umechza. The Korban Tamid shel bein ha'arboim is shechted on the eight and a half hours into the day. That's 2.5 hours after Chatzos. V'korev b'teisha umechza. And it's brought onto the Mizbeach 1 hour later, 9.5 hours into the day. In other words, it needed an entire hour to then deal with the blood, being mekabel the blood, putting the blood on the Mizbeach, flailing the korban by skinning it, then taking off the parts of the body, and ultimately then putting the animal on the Mizbeach. All of this required an hour, and therefore it was nikrav on 9.5 hours into the day. Be'arvei Psachim, on Erev Pesach, when it was needed to then have more time to then bring the Korban Pesach, since it was the Korban Pesach that was brought after the Korban Tamid, then Nishchat b'shevo mechzo v'kore b'shmono mechzo. Then the Korban Tamid shel bein ha'arbaim was, we preceded 1 hour by then shechting it on the 7.5 hours into the day, and bringing it onto the Mizbeach 8.5 hours into the day. Bein bechol, bein b'Shabbos, this was too, whether it was a weekday or it was on Shabbos. Chal Erev Pesach liyos be'erev Shabbos, when Erev Pesach comes to be on Erev Shabbos, now there's even more of a need to be makdim the Korban Tamid. Because again, not only does the Korban Pesach have to come after the Korban Tamid, shel bein ha'arboim, but on Erev Shabbos, it also has to then finish roasting the meat before nightfall, before Shabbos, because it would be usher to roast the meat on Shabbos. So therefore, says the Mishnah, if it's Chal Erev Pesach liyos be'erev Shabbos, then Nishchat b'sheshu mechza, the Korev b'sheva umechza. Then the Korban Pesach is shechted the earliest time possible, which is a half an hour after Chatzos, 6.5 hours into the day. And then it was brought onto the Mizbeach 1 hour later, 7.5 hours into the day. The Mishnah concludes with the words Vaha Pesach Achorav. This is what we had mentioned until now, more than once now, that the Korban Pesach is different than all the other korbanos. The other korbanos must be brought before the Korban Tamid shel bein ha'arboim. However, Korban Pesach is different. It has to be dafka brought after the Korban Tamid shel bein ha'arboim. The Gemara asks right away, Hani Menahani Mili, from where do we know these words that the Korban Pesach, the Tamid shel bein ha'arboim is brought it's shechted on the 8.5 hours into the day, and it's brought onto the Mizbeach 1 hour later. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Domakro, he brings a pasuk. Es hakeves echod hasa b'boiker, ves hakeves hasheni teis hasa ben ha'arboim. It says in regards to the carbon tamid, the communal offering, the daily offering requires one keves of a carbon tamid shel shachar in the morning, and one keves to be brought in the afternoon, ben ha'arboim. So why does it say ben ha'arboim instead of ha'erev or ba'erev? Chalkeu lebein shnei arovim, to make a distinction, to mechalek between the two afternoons. Beis shos umechze lekan, ubeis shos umechze lekan, v'sho achas la'asiyaso. 2.5 hours in either side, and 1 hour in the middle. In other words, you have 2.5 hours after Chatzois, which is 8.5 hours. That's when it is shechted. And then 1 hour to then deal with the carbon, as we said, dealing with the dam, and flailing the carbon, as well as then severing its limbs and putting onto the mizbeach. All that requires 1 hour, whereby you have, again, 2.5 hours to the end of the day. Because after 9.5 hours to the end of the day is 12, that's 2.5 hours. So we have 2.5 hours before, that's one of the Bein Ha'arboim, one of the afternoons. 2.5 hours is also at the end at the end of the afternoon. In other words, and in between there's 1 hour. That's the drush that Rabbi Shua ben Levi makes of Bein Ha'arboim. Masiv Rava asks, Be'arvei Psachim nishchat b'sheva u'mechza v'kar b'shmona u'mechza bein bechol bein Shabbos. Our Mishnah taught us that when it comes to Erev Pesach, then the carbon tamid shel bein ha'arboim is made earlier by 1 hour. And therefore it's shechted 7.5 hours into the day, and it's brought on the Mizbeach 8.5 hours into the day. Asks Rava, if it's true what you're saying, Rabbi Shua ben Levi, that there's chalkeu between the two afternoons, 2.5 hours on each side, and that's mid d'oraisa. Asks Rav, Yisaka daita b'shmono mechza d'oraisa, hechi makdamin lei. How is it possible to make it earlier? Granted, we want to make it for convenient purposes, so that we can have more time to then bring the carbon Pesach. But if indeed the carbon Tami Shel Ben Ha'arboim must be brought 2.5 hours after Chatzois, in between the two afternoons, then how is it possible to then make it 1 hour earlier? Elomar Rava, rather Rava says, where do we know that indeed the carbon Tami Shel Ben Ha'arboim is brought 8.5 hours into the day? Because mitzvosoi de tamid mishiyanotu tzilulei aref. Because the mitzvah of the carbon tamid is from when the afternoon shadow begins to then lengthen. And that's only 6.5 hours into the day. That's the earliest time, half hour after Chatzois. My time, what's the reason for this? Domar Kra, as the pasuk says, Bein Ha'arboim. Me'idna dematchil shimshul mi'arav. That means to say from the time that the sun begins to set. So therefore, when does it begin to set? It becomes nicker. That's only a half an hour after Chatzois, and therefore midi araisa, the earliest time a person can bring the carbon tamid shel bein ha'arboim is 6.5 hours into the day. Hilkach, therefore, bishar yemois hashana the ikin nedarim and novois, since there are personal karbonos, nedarim and novos that must be brought before the carbon tamid shel bein ha'arboim, we want to give enough time for them to be brought, and therefore the Rachmon Omar aleh chalvei hashlomim. V'omar mar aleh hashleim kol ha-karbonos kulam. Since the pasuk teaches me that it has to be brought dafka before the carbon tamid shel ben ha'arboim, as we learn in regards to the carbon tamid shel shachar in the morning, it states aleh chelvei hashlomim. Upon it is the fats of the shlomim. From here, the Gemara makes a drasha. Aleh hashleim kol ha-karbonos kulam. Upon it, referring to the carbon tamid shel boiker shel shachar, upon that carbon tamid, then you have to be mashlim afterwards all of the other personal carbonos. The Gemara then makes a diuk, but that's only in regard to the carbon tamid shel shachar in the morning. But the carbon tamid shel ben ha'arboim, you cannot bring any carbonos afterwards. Therefore, since you cannot bring the nedarim and davos after the korban tamid shel bein ha'arboim, therefore we then extend and bring the time to 8.5 hours. We give 2 extra hours so that we can bring the other korbanos. Ba'arvei Psachim de'ika Pesach acharov. On Erev Pesach, when you need to bring the korban Pesach davka after the korban tamid shel bein ha'arboim, you need more time for that. Then kadminon le sha'achas v'avdinon le b'sheva u'mechza. Then we precede 1 hour and we bring the korban tamid shel bein ha'arboim on the 7.5 hours into the day, so that we have enough time to then bring the korban tamid to the korban Pesach afterwards. Chal Erev Pesach liyos Erev Shabbos. When Erev Pesach comes out to be on Erev Shabbos, and then we said not only does the korban Pesach have to be brought after the korban tamid shel bein ha'arboim, but also we must roast the meat before Shabbos. So therefore we even need more time. So the ikonamitz liyosa de lodachi Shabbos mukminon le adine b'sheish umechza. Then we shech the korban tamid shel bein ha'arboim the earliest possible time, which is a half an hour after Chatzos, 6.5 hours into the day. Tanu Rabban, the Gemara brings the following brayso: Kisiduroi bechol kach siduroi b'Shabbos. Di Rabbi Shmuel. Like the order during the week, so too is the order on Shabbos. Those are the words of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva oimer kisidur be'erev Pesach. Like its order, referring to the korban tamid, is on erev Pesach. My ka'amar, the Gemara wants to make sense of this brayso. What was stated over here? The words of Rabbi Shmuel and the words of Rabbi Akiva. Omar Abaye Hochi Ka'omar. Abaye explains and says this is what it was saying. Kisiduroi bechol be'erev Pesach, like its order, referring to the korban tamid shel bein ha'arboim, which is during the week, on a weekday, on erev Pesach, which means to say that on a weekday on erev Pesach, the korban tamid shel bein ha'arboim is brought 7.5 hours into the day. Kach siduroi b'Shabbos be'erev Pesach, divrei Bishmuel. So too, on Shabbos, when it's Erev Pesach, that also will then have the korban tamid shel bein ha'arboim to be brought 7.5 hours into the day. Rabbi Akiva oimer kesidur be'erev ha'Pesach shachal liyos be'erev Shabbos kach sidur b'Shabbos. Rabbi Akiva argues and says the same way that the order of the korban tamid shel bein ha'arboim on Erev Pesach that's chal on Erev Shabbos, which was brought the 6.5 hours into the day, so too on a regular Shabbos it's going to be brought 6.5 hours onto the day. In other words, so too he's going to say that we'll also makdim on Shabbos to be 6.5 hours. Umas nisan diktani bein bechol bein b'Shabbos Rabbi Shmuel. That which it states in our Mishnah, whether it's Chol, the weekday, or it's Shabbos on Erev Pesach, it's going to be the same time. Those are the words of Rabbi Shmuel, because Rabbi Shmuel said, if it's going to be on Erev Pesach during the week, it's going to be brought, the korban tamid shel bein ha'arboim, 7.5 hours into the day. And if it's going to be Shabbos on Erev Pesach, it'll also be brought 7.5 hours into the day. So that is going to be the word of Rabbi Yishmael. Ask the Gemara, but my kamifliki, after all, what is the understanding of Rabbi Shmuel over here? If on Shabbos there's no nedarim and nedavos to be brought, so why doesn't he makdim the korban tamid shel bein ha'arboim on Erev Pesach to be 6.5 hours into the day, just as Rabbi Akiva does? Why does he say it's only brought 7.5 hours into the day? So the Gemara is asking, but my kamifli, what is the machlokes between Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Akiva? Again, Rabbi Shmuel says that it's brought 7.5 hours even on Shabbos. Rabbi Akiva says 6.5 hours. Says the Gemara, b'musafim koidmin lebezichin kamifligi. There's a machlokes over here whether you bring the korban musaf before or after the spoons, literally the spoons of the lavoina, the frank incense that was brought and put on the lechem hapanim. The lechem hapanim every week was changed. The old one was taken away and the new one was brought in. Before the old one was taken away and dispersed amongst the kohanim to eat, they would take the 2 spoons of lavoina and they would burn it on the mizbeach. So that would be matir the kohanim to eat the lechem haponim. So the question is, when did that happen? Did it happen before or after the karban musaf? So that's our machlokes over here as well. The Rabbi Shmuel sovar musafin koidim lebezichin. Rabbi Shmuel holds that the karban musaf, which is brought in the 6th hour, that preceded the bezichin, which is brought in the 7th hour. Ovad lehu lemusafin b'sheish u'bezichin b'sheva v'ovad letami b'sheva u'mechza. Once we say that the musafin was brought in the 6th hour, the levoina, the spoons were brought in the 7th hour, then the karban tamid ben arbaim is brought 7.5 hours into the day. Those are the words of Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva savar bezichin kaidim the musafin. He says the bezichin is kodem, it's before the musafin. In other words, the bezichin was brought in the 5th hour, and the musafin were brought in the 6th hour, whereby it allows you to then bring the karban tamid ben arbaim 6.5 hours into the day, as follows: bezichin bechamesh, musafin b'sheish, ve'avid le'letami b'sheish u'mechza. And therefore it frees up to bring the karban tamid ben arbaim 6.5 hours into the day, according to Rabbi Akiva.